On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This episode of Life Science Success is brought to you by 5280 Life Sciences Consulting. If you need help setting your strategy, meeting your operational goals, or are selecting and implementing critical technology in your business, we should talk. Visit 5280lifescience.com to schedule a meeting and find out more.
Today on the podcast, I'd like to welcome Francesco Salituro. Welcome, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Donald. Appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. I am looking forward to our conversation today and really looking forward to digging in a little bit in terms of your background and overall all the different things that you've done in life sciences. I guess where I'd like to start is, can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your career?
Yeah, I guess I'll do just the cliff notes there would be, I'm originally from the Midwest, born and raised in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Did my schooling, both graduate and postgraduate, in the Wisconsin and Illinois area. And since my postdoc in 1986, I've been in pharmaceutical industry ever since. It's 34 years plus. And I've enjoyed a really nice career. Been working in a lot of different therapeutic areas, and it's been good. And of recent, I've started up my own consulting, and I'm working with a number of startup companies that are just really more or less in the stealth stage right now.
So if I understand it, you went from Kenosha, Wisconsin to Cambridge. Is that correct?
Pretty much. That's the long haul. And there certainly were a lot of stops in between. From what I just mentioned regarding the cliff notes of my background, I'll dig into a little more detail. So I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin. My parents were immigrants from Italy. And in fact, I was born, I think it was probably about 5 or 6 months after my mom came back to Kenosha from Italy for the second time. I could have been born in Italy if she had waited a little longer, but I was born in Kenosha. It was pretty much a blue-collar Midwestern town. I had a lot of different ethnic backgrounds. And in the neighborhood where I grew up in, it was all Italians, and most of them were pretty much off the boat. That's just the way things were for immigration back then, but it was a really good experience growing up there. And again, I eventually went to undergraduate school there in the UW system. University of Wisconsin Parkside is part of the UW system. I did my bachelor's degree there. Then I did a PhD in Madison, Wisconsin at the pharmacy school. And from there, I moved and did a postdoc at the University of Illinois in Champaign. That was a couple of years. And then, as I mentioned already, in 1986, I moved to Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. That was my first industry job. That was in 1986. Stayed there 7 years. And I'll tell you the next step. But before I go to the next step, I'll mention that pretty much at every stop, Madison, Champaign-Urbana, and Cincinnati, we managed to have 3 children, and one in each place. One in each place, so that's pretty interesting. But in 1993, we packed up and moved to the East Coast, and I joined Vertex Pharmaceuticals at the time. It's a pretty big company today, but it was a relatively small, young, barely 3-year-old startup at that point. And those were really the days when the whole small company build, biotech kind of arena started to get its claws into me, and that was a great experience. But been in Cambridge ever since, and worked at a few different companies since. Wyeth and Agios and Sage were the companies that I was at after Vertex, but all good experiences. So basically, that's how we made it from Wisconsin to Cambridge. It was, the first part of it was school and postdoc, and then the remainder of it was career and in the pharmaceutical industry. When I think of Kenosha, and I still think about it a lot, of course, because we still have family there. My wife and I still have a good number of family and some good friends there. So we get back. It's been a year now, unfortunately, of course, with everything going on, but we would get back pretty often. But Kenosha, like I said, a pretty simple industry, blue-collar town when I grew up. It's quite a bit different now than it was in many ways, but the things that I really like about Kenosha are really all the mom and pop Italian restaurants. They make pizza different and very unique from anywhere else that I've had it in the country. I'm not exactly sure why it's different, but it really just is. And there are a lot of really nice one-off mom and pops that are just fantastic. And my mom and my dad's passed away at this stage, but they knew quite a few of them that had opened some of the restaurants. So it's always great getting back there.
How did you get into science in the first place? What led you towards a career in science?
Yeah, so I've been getting that question a bit, and quite honestly, it was as best that I could recall. It really was just a slow evolution into it. I remember as a kid always being very intrigued by just nature and the outdoors, and things worked. And ultimately that bloomed through coursework and in school and in high school and so on, learning some basics of science and chemistry and biology from early school days and just being very intrigued by it. And when it came time to go to college, I didn't know quite exactly what I wanted to do, and that was the kind of the case for a long time. But what was pretty consistent and what was really much driving me at the time, even just entering into college, was just a real desire to learn as much science as I possibly could. And I just, when I got to Parkside, I just ate it up. I just took in as much science in both chemistry and biology. I nearly double majored. And it was just because I just needed to learn all this stuff. I still remember my first introductory biology class in college, and everything that we were learning across a pretty broad spectrum of biology was just absolutely fascinating me. I just couldn't believe how complex the whole biological biochemical system was, and had never really realized it, digging into the real details of what goes on in biochemistry in our bodies and so on. And again, I just wanted to learn more and more. So it started out when I was little and learning a little bit about science and just being really curious. I will tell you one really silly story that I do remember. And it was, I don't know, I might have been like 5 or 6 years old, something like that. And let me preface this by saying my main arena, besides drug discovery as a whole, my main arena in academia and in my earliest years of industry, the pharmaceutical industry, is chemistry, organic chemistry. But back when I was about 5 or 6 years old, it was a summer day, I'm recalling, and I had this container, and I can't it probably wasn't plastic, because I don't think there were a lot of plastic containers back then. It was probably glass. Maybe it was like an empty mouthwash bottle or something like that. I can't remember. But I recall pretty distinctly starting to fill this bottle with all sorts of stuff, like pieces of grass and some weeds and dandelion and some dirt and some probably a few bugs, an ant, a grasshopper, whatever, and then a whole bunch of water. And I put in a little bit of soap, and I was making something. I honestly don't remember exactly what I thought it was going to do once it was all complete. But I made this, and I actually went door to some of our neighbors to try to sell it as something, as a concoction that did something. That part of it I remember. And I do remember one of my neighbors was, her name was Barbara Acerbi. They had some kids that were our age as well. But she actually bought it for me for, I think, a nickel, I guess, trying to make me feel good. It was that kind of level of curiosity of just creating something out of nothing that it just really started way back then.
Your first money in science. Congratulations. That's
5 cents. Hey,
good story, right?
That bought half an ice cream back then.
So then you go to Vertex and Wyeth and Sage. So in each of those, are you focused on organic chemistry or drug discovery, or?
It was all real. The ends to the means there was really all drug discovery. So you were using all the science to create potential new drugs, new therapies for various disorders across a wide spectrum. That's the one common piece across all of the drugs. But as you get into pharmaceutical drug discovery, and I think this is probably pretty true across disciplines. For myself, I went in as a chemist, and you're a bench chemist for a while, and you're making molecules and so on. And certainly you're learning the key skills, or you're using the key skills that you learned in college. But the end all there is to get a drug and get something that's worthy of putting into clinical trials and so on, that has pharmacological activity that you can get eventually into clinical trials. And in order to do that, it just doesn't stop at chemistry. It doesn't stop at just making the molecule. It involves studying it across all of these different disciplines. And that's the beauty, at least for me, that's the beauty and the really huge interest in drug discovery, is that you have to learn a good bit about a lot of different technologies and a lot of different functional arenas like in vitro pharmacology, DMPK, toxicology, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a real much larger picture with a lot of different moving parts to really achieve the goal that you ultimately intend to do in any of these companies. That's the common piece. Each company is going to have their different ways of doing things, of course, and different areas of focus, but that's a common piece.
Then in your own consulting company now, you said that you're working with, early stage companies. Just curious. So what do you focus on now, and how are you helping the early stage companies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think that could certainly be very different things for different people, because some folks may tend to focus on certain therapeutic areas that they want to stay in, and that's perfectly fine and absolutely useful. Others like to focus in on different aspects of consulting. For me, and I guess partially this starts with the fact that across all the companies I've worked in, I've touched on a lot of different therapeutic areas. There was never any one arena that I stayed in for a vast majority of the time. I was in CNS disorders, I was in immunology, infection, virology, oncology, a whole number of different things. And sometimes in CNS early days, and then CNS a couple decades or a couple decades after. It's a real mix. And I always enjoyed that part. For me, I found great interest and great satisfaction in working in any of those particular disease arenas. What I had decided to focus on more as far as being a consultant and deciding what companies I would work with, what I decided to focus on more there was to work with the really early stage companies, the real stealth companies that maybe are just looking for their seed round of funding, or just after their seed round of funding, or after their Series A. Small company that's just looking for their footing on what they're going to do and what they're going to be. Because for me, that it just adds an extra element of complexity and interest. Certainly any company that's going to get started up, they have some kind of a focus. They're going to focus on this target or this therapeutic area, et cetera, and they're in it to make that work. But the other part of it that is hugely important is about percolating and growing, cultivating and evolving a small company into a larger entity that's going to be successful. And that's a lot of different stuff that can apply to any company, regardless of therapeutic area. And that's the stuff that I really am interested in helping these small companies really find their footing, what's going to be successful and what's not, how to prioritize things, how to basically build a small biotech company into a larger, thriving, successful company. So that's kind of what I focus on for clients.
Yeah, I have similar interest in companies that are a little further along than I think what you're describing. But the way I normally describe it is I love kind of the chaos.
I call it controlled chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think in addition to that chaos, it has to somewhat be structured and provide a little bit of direction in terms of, are you marching towards the goal that you're aiming at the end, or are you doing lots of activities overall and that might not actually end in the result that you're looking for?
Yeah, exactly. You definitely have to have that mentality about you, because a lot of early things don't work. And I'll tell you straight away, both Agios and Sage were the companies that I joined at very early stages. I was employee number 7 at Agios and number 5 at Sage. So really early days. And I'll tell you what, in both of those companies, the earliest stage projects didn't work. And it was through the foresight of the employees who were there at the time to really understand that the gold is not going to be here. It's going to be somewhere else. And you take the you take the important decision to go after that. So you have to be comfortable with a little bit of chaos. You have to be comfortable with a little bit of, actually, maybe a lot of things not working. I don't like to say failure anymore because it's not really failure. It's just learning what doesn't work. You have to be able to embrace change, and things are a little scary and a little risky. You have to be able to embrace that sort of thing. And that's really quite different than a later stage company. And it's the beauty of it too, because it's a whole different kind of beast when it's a larger company, quite different than early days. But obviously really quite necessary to have those skills too, because it's what you're striving for, the small company to grow into some larger entity that's going to be really successful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've even talked to on the podcast different people that have pivoted along the way. They definitely have started maybe 2 or 3 other companies, and maybe things didn't work out there, but they took what they learned and pivoted and continued on with something maybe slightly different, but also met the end stage and they came up with something that was truly scalable at that point because it had been refined a couple of different times through the learning. So for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important concept to understand that science begets more science. Questions, you go after questions, try to answer them. And the answers, that's why I don't like to say failure anymore, because the answers, you either get something that you predicted or that you think you were going to get from a system, or it's something completely unexpected. And then you refine your thinking and move to the next steps. So it's more of that than real failure. I have a website and I have some favorite quotes that are scrolling on it. And one of them, I think, is one from Thomas Edison. It goes something like, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways of this thing not working." It's
not making a light bulb. Remember that one. Yeah. In terms of trends that you're maybe seeing in the industry now with things like next generation sequencing or CRISPR, or our ability to better understand the genome, are you seeing any sort of shifts in terms of the way that we're developing drugs?
Oh, yeah. And that's been something that's happening for a couple decades, really. It's pretty interesting. So if you go back around 20 years or so, late 1990s, early 2000s, I think it was, when I think we had the complete genome sequence at that point. And I lived through this, of course, but if you were to go back and read articles and things that people were saying and predicting back then, the expectation almost was that we got the genome now, so everything's going to just all of a sudden be completely focused on precision medicine and individualized medicine, and we're going to have a better understanding of targets, what targets to work on, which ones are mutated, et cetera. And all those arenas are certainly developing, but it was certainly not the next day or next year or even next couple of years of a sudden flood of understanding new targets and how to deal with them. I think we're still probably on the upswing of that, where we're seeing a lot more on the ability to sequence. For example, in oncology, we sequence patient samples and so on all the time to understand what kind of cancer they have. Do they have a mutation that is a driving mutation that could potentially speak to some level of precision medicine there? And there's been a lot of drugs that are of that ilk, essentially in oncology, where through genotyping, they've understood the target that was important to impact on in order to affect this particular disease. So that's happening. And then, of course, with gene therapy and all the CRISPR technology, as you mentioned, it's certainly, I think, going more towards precision medicine, if you will. But it's been a long time coming. Like I said, I think that this is 2 decades into the genome, and I bet we're still just scratching the surface right now.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I know for a long time we thought that RNA was just the junk that was included with the DNA. There's probably still even more for us to continue to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all sorts of things going on there with antisense and RNA as an actual drug target. I don't know tremendous about that arena, but it's an emerging arena over the last few years. I think the future for drug discovery is pretty rich. There's a lot happening, and certainly a lot of things today that we would have thought of as being fantasy 30 plus years ago when I joined in the industry. It's been some real strides for sure.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to just change gears with you a little bit and talk about your son. I saw that you have a charity that is
Yes.
known as Joseph's Hope Scholarship Fund.
Yes.
And it's somehow linked with the Epilepsy Foundation of New England. Just would like
Yes.
to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And an important topic and an important part of our lives, myself and my family, my wife and my family's right now. So I guess the story really starts with our eldest son, Joseph. He was born in Madison, Wisconsin. He passed away in 2011, just a little over 10 years ago now. And he had epilepsy. And he basically passed away from SUDEP, which for those who don't know what that is, sudden unexplained death in epilepsy. And certainly a very trying time for us, for sure. But the short story is that we took that very difficult point in time of losing a child, Joseph, to help us find a way. And him having epilepsy, of course, really drew us to the goings on of the Epilepsy Foundation of New England. So we started to get in touch with them and interact with them and participate in some of the many fundraising things that they had ongoing. So we started out with that. And then as we were in the throes of organizing and participating in one of their walks one year, we just were thinking about what could we do a little bit more that was more geared towards honoring our son and helping us heal and doing some good for other young adults and children with epilepsy. So we started this idea of the Joseph's Hope Scholarship Fund, which was going to focus on scholarships for young adults with epilepsy, looking for financial help going into college. And at that point, we were already part of the Epilepsy Foundation in New England. I had been on the board for a year or so. And rather than start our own charity, we essentially went and took this underneath the umbrella of the Epilepsy Foundation, able to use some of their infrastructures to help us to organize new events and so on. And it started to become a pretty good moneymaker for the scholarships, and then we more recently expanded it to an emergency fund to help families in general who were having any short-term financial difficulties. The other part of that story is that when we were in the throes of deciding what do we want to do in terms of a charity, what kind of events do we do, how do we build this? So what do we use to draw people? The answer was right in front of our noses, because at that particular point in time, I had been playing in some rock and roll bands for a while. And also at that time, I had access to a venue that I could use anytime for free. So our first few events turned out to be concert events at that venue. And we just started to raise some money, and it just grew from there.
What a great story in terms of really using that unfortunate event and celebrating that event in a way that helps other people. Thank you for that work. It sounds like it's very important. And especially right now with COVID going on and things like that, I'm sure that there are lots of people that are hurting.
Absolutely. It really has grown. I think our first event, just in terms of dollars, our first event raised somewhere around $7,500, and we were absolutely beside ourselves. We'd raised this money with really minimal effort. This last year, even with COVID, we managed to do a couple of virtual events, and between the two, I think we raised somewhere pretty close to 70. So it's really expanded and taken on a new life, which we really enjoyed continuing to do. It's amazing how it started. All the pieces were just right in front of our noses. And all we had to do was realize, hey, we can put all these things together and come up with this kind of an event.
I'm so sorry to hear about the loss of your son, but at the same time, it seems like you've really used that as a good advantage as well to help a lot of people. So
yeah,
excellent job.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to ask everyone that's on the podcast the following 3 questions. So what inspires you?
Oh, I guess I'm continuing. I'm continued to be inspired by science. It is certainly one thing for sure. I've just not grown. Again, I'm 34 years into the industry, just turned 63, not that old, but I'm still really intrigued by science and learning new things and learning about new approaches. That's one thing. The other, I think, maybe
Great.
bigger thing, though, is that these are things that really intrigue me and inspire me, but the level of impact that they can have on helping people potentially is just amazing. And
For
I'm very fortunate to be able to say that I've had the experience across a couple of the companies I've worked with of seeing some of our early research end up in marketed drugs. And that's probably what the biggest inspiration you could ever get, because that's what you really strive for. And then to actually realize it is really extraordinary. And to think that there may be a potential to do it again, that inspires me.
Excellent. And so what concerns you?
Oh, wow. There's a lot to talk about these days, isn't there? I tell you what I think concerns me the most. And there certainly are a lot of big problems that the US and the world really needs to solve. That's for sure. Across the whole social political climate world that we are, there's a lot of problems to solve. As I think about it, though, that's not really what concerns me. What concerns me more is that I think oftentimes we're just not focusing on the right things. It's a situation where you've heard the old cliche of blood is thicker than water, but now it seems like politics is thicker than blood. That concerns me. And in addition to that, it's with all these problems that we're facing, all these important issues that we're facing, I think sometimes as a society where we find ourselves focusing on either really silly or on non-issues that are of minimal importance or no importance whatsoever. And I think also that bleeds into sometimes it seems like our society is too satisfied with mediocrity and not the important things. And you know what? I just this week, two fantastic examples. Who would have ever thought that the sexuality or the race of Mr. Potato Head would be an item of such importance that it needs to be discussed and, in quotes, fixed and so on. And similar things with, come on, Disney movies from decades and decades ago. And the Muppet, come on, what are we talking, what are we spending our time on? That's what concerns me, is that we're just not hitting on the right cylinders here sometimes. And there's plenty of things that we've got to concern ourselves with and work on. Let's be real here. Some of these things just aren't important.
Yeah, I'm thankful I missed at least the wanting to know the sex of Mr. Potato Head news story. So that I completely missed that one, thankfully. And
yeah. Unbelievable.
But,
it's really just maddening.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm a firm believer overall in terms of driving towards an action and not sitting stagnant and accepting mediocrity.
Yeah.
But I've certainly worked in plenty of places that there's a continual battle to keep the status quo, and been other companies that I've been in that I continually challenge the leaders and question, is this really what we want to do? Whatever we're supposed to be so focused on, driving the next generation of innovation, seems to me like we're investing in the wrong things.
It's so important too. And there's one other major lesson that I've learned over this one more over the last 12 years or so with starting companies. And it's bled into also our involvement in the Joseph Hope Scholarship Fund and the Epilepsy Foundation. It's the concept of, people like to be busy and sometimes they like to revel in that whole concept that, I'm staying busy. And is it impactful though? Are you busy because you're just moving stuff around, or are you really doing things that are impactful? And again, that kind of bleeds into all, not just career, but the whole of the Epilepsy Foundation. It was the main reason why we wanted all of our dollars to impact directly people who were looking to go into school, doing something very positive and tangible for somebody, versus, I want to raise money for research. You raise $10,000 or $15,000, and that's nice, but it's not going to go very far in research, and you're not going to get anything tangible out of it. So it's all about impact.
And I think there's a quote by the military. One of the branches, I believe, uses this quote where it's all thrust and no vector is what they talk about. So essentially you have a lot of, it may be force behind you, but you're not really trying to get anywhere in particular.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And what excites you?
Oh, that's a cool question. It's a lot of simple stuff, actually. I love playing with my band. Absolutely. It's just a great experience, especially the band we've had of late in the early part of 2018. So just about, 3 years ago, just around now, we started the band called Almost a Cure. And we're a great band, a fun group of people, and we're just all over it and going to continue on as long as we can. I love that. And it excites me just to think about we're going to start practice again and bring in some new songs. That's great. Cooking a nice meal, opening a nice bottle of wine, whether it's just us at home or with friends. Simple stuff. I love the whole planning of it and the executing of it. It's just the best. I like a cigar every once in a while. And I love a fire pit in warm weather on the weekends. If I don't get a fire pit in on a Friday or Saturday night during spring, summer, fall, it's just not a complete weekend. I love that. So it's a lot of simple things. I do have to admit that when I can, I love driving my M4. That's probably the most complicated thing I've got, but it's in general a lot of simple things that are just enjoyed with the family and friends.
That is excellent. Francesco Salituro, I wanted to thank you again for being on the podcast. I think it's been a fantastic conversation with you. I've really enjoyed so many of your answers and just in general, the discussion that we've had about your background and what you're doing and the impact that you're having on life sciences. So thank you for that. And also thank you for, all the great work that you're doing with the Epilepsy Foundation of New England and Joseph's Hope Scholarship Fund. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you very much.
I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invite. I really enjoyed the discussion. I like to tell stories. I like to talk. Sometimes I ramble a lot, but I really enjoyed this. And I just really appreciate the invite.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.